You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, I thought we'd discuss the importance of cricket history and why is it important to learn about the history of cricket. I thought that was a pretty good discussion topic to talk about on this episode of the podcast today. Why is it important to learn about the history of cricket and the importance of cricket history? I think it's very important that everyone who loves cricket, who loves this great game as we all do, to explore, learn about the history of the game. Because I think it's very important to learn about the history. And I think it's very important for young cricket fans as well coming into the game. I think it's important for them to learn about the history of the game as well. Obviously, I can remember when I started getting into cricket back in the day. It's many years ago since I first got into cricket and started playing the game. Obviously, I was very captivated by the game, and obviously that's why I've loved it ever since. And that's why we always get into cricket that way, in terms of we love it, we love playing the game, and we want to learn more about it. And for me, over the years, since I was a little kid, up until a few years after I started playing cricket, I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to explore this game and tap into the history and what the game was all about and how the game's changed over the years. And I thought, let's do some research and let's do it. Whenever you mention history, to a lot of people think it's a bit boring. Who really wants to learn the history of something? We've all gone to school and, we sit in history class and, we're a bit bored by, listening to the teacher about history and about certain things. But it can be exciting, and it's very important to learn about the history of many things in life, but also in sport as well, but also in cricket. Cricket has so many stories to tell, and they're just waiting to be explored. They're waiting to be tapped in, and waiting for us to explore those stories and understand those stories as well throughout the years in cricket. Obviously, you learn so much by learning the history of the game of cricket. You learn about how certain things got introduced into cricket and how they are used today in the modern era, in this present moment. And once you learn about the history of cricket, you fully appreciate cricket for what it is, and you really start to understand what cricket's all about. Now, the cricket tragic like myself, and many other cricket fans are cricket tragics and love the game to bits. We've been watching the game for years. We know certain aspects. We know certain things. We know how the game operates. But even us cricket tragics and real true cricket fans, we don't know everything about cricket. We don't know what happened back in the 1700s or the 1800s or the 1900s within the game of cricket. So it's very important for us to learn about all these things. And I find it very interesting going back and learning about the history of the game, because you learn something every day. You learn something new every day. And I think that's very important, to take some time to learn something new. It could be a skill. It could be, in this case, the history of cricket or a certain sport or anything like that. I think it's very important that we learn about the history. So that's why this episode is titled The Importance of Cricket History, and why is it important to learn about the history of cricket? Because I feel like we need to encourage everyone to get into the spirit of researching, reading up about the game, enjoying the game, of course, by playing it, but also enjoy the game by learning about the game and where the game has come from. So we have the game that we have today. Because cricket's changed dramatically over the years. It's evolved dramatically since the 1700s when the first cricket matches were recorded, up until the present day in 2022. It's a vastly different game. And it's very fascinating looking at the changes and looking how the game's evolved over the years. I find it very fascinating, and it's brilliant to just pick up a book or watch a documentary, which I do on cricket, on certain things within cricket, and also hear other people's thoughts and what they found in their research, which is quite interesting. And it's very important that we take the time to do that, especially, as I mentioned before, with young cricket fans, because at that age, you're just learning about the game and you want to learn more. And that's the same with me, as I mentioned before, learning about the game, and I wanted to learn more. And I still want to learn more about the game to this day. And you always find ways to keep learning and keep building your knowledge about the game as well. So it's very important that we do that. And many people who get into cricket, they don't know the history. They don't know certain things that have happened because, as I mentioned before, history, that perception that we have, it's boring, not really interested in it. I think, it's very important to educate them on particular parts of the game in terms of the history, and it's quite fascinating. But obviously we've got to break down that perception about history being boring. But cricket history is quite interesting. And also we got to tap into those stories. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of stories to be told in the game of cricket. Throughout its long historical history, there's a lot of history to be tapped into. It's just waiting to be discovered by us. You want to take the time and research it. And I think it's very important to do that. It's very interesting to, read up about old players and many players that have had a significant impact on the game, which many people don't remember. Obviously, some people remember some historical players that have made a significant impact on the game. For example, Sir Donald Bradman, who obviously was, the best batsman that ever played the game of cricket. But also remembering the other players of his time as well, and even going way back. For example, like Sir Jack Hobbs from England, W.G. Grace from England as well, Victor Trumper from Australia, M.A. Noble from Australia as well. All of these legendary players that people don't really remember or haven't even heard of. So it's very important to look back and to research those great players as well. And I find it very fascinating doing that. And I've got a lot of time to research and to learn more about the game, which is very important. And that's why we're discussing this question today. Why is it important to learn about the history of cricket? I'm very passionate about it, and I want other people to be passionate about learning about the history of the game as well. Because once the history disappears, people forget it, and then it gets forgotten forever. So it's very important to preserve the history and to make sure that it's there for future generations of cricket supporters and young fans coming through. And I think in cricket, we do that very well than other sports, I think, because we always do our best to preserve the history. And an example of this is by the many museums all around the world. Now, there are many famous cricket museums around the world. Number one's the Lord's Museum at the home of cricket, which is Lord's, obviously, in England. Obviously, that museum has a lot of artefacts. Obviously, it has the Ashes urn, of course, that Australia and England play for the Ashes. It's got a lot of history there. Obviously, the Adelaide Oval Museum in Adelaide, at the Adelaide Oval, it's got a lot of cricket memorabilia, a lot of artefacts on the game as well. The Cricket Museum in Bowral, the Bowral Museum, the Bradman Museum, I should say, in Bowral, has got a lot of cricket artefacts, a lot of history on the game as well. And also at the MCG and the Sports Museum, it's got a lot of cricket artefacts and memorabilia and of the game there. So I think we do that very well in cricket. We always like to preserve the history. We like to educate others on the game as well. And we have that sense of tradition because cricket is such a traditional game. And we like to reflect on the traditions and the history of the game, and we like to showcase that to people all around the world. So I think we're doing a very good job in terms of preserving the history in cricket, which is important because we need to do that to make sure that the future generations of cricket fans and cricket lovers appreciate the history and what the game stands for and how the game has evolved and changed over these testing times, but over these changing periods in time, which is very important. And yeah, it's such an important thing to learn about it. And I hope today in this episode of the podcast, I think many people, if you're listening to this episode of the podcast, hopefully it inspires you to go and take the time to research about the game. Research about certain things within the game that you may have not heard of before, you may have not known. That's the beauty about learning something new, is that you learn something new and then you're like, oh, I didn't know that before. So it's great to know about that. So it's very important to learn about the history and to learn about the game's history, which is very important. So hopefully everyone listening to this episode of the podcast today will take the time to do that. I really hope you do, because it's worth it to fully appreciate the game and its history, which is very important. And in cricket, as I mentioned before, we do that very well. So that's great to do, obviously, to maintain the history and to preserve it, which is important. Now, we've talked about the importance of cricket history in this episode today, and why is it important to learn about the history of cricket. I hope you got a few ideas yourself on how to go about researching the history and that, which is great. And hopefully you take the time to do that because it's very important to fully appreciate the game for what it is. Before we end this episode of the podcast today, since we've been talking about the history of the game and the importance of it, and why is it important to learn about the history of cricket, here on the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast, we're going to be starting a new series on the podcast all about the history of the game. So we're going to be looking back at many, many things that has happened in cricket over the years, historically. So it's about educating people on the history of the game, looking back at historical moments in the game, looking back at the history of all the cricketing nations and how they came into cricket, looking back at the history of some of the historic cricket grounds in the world. There's many historic cricket grounds around the world that have graced cricket over the years. Looking back at some of the well-known cricket players and their contribution to the game, but also looking back at the lesser-known cricket players and their contribution to the game as well, because their story needs to be told as well. And we often forget about the lesser-known cricket players. Obviously, we know the well-known cricket players like Donald Bradman, for example, but we don't know the lesser-known cricket players. So it's very important to tell their story and how they made an impact on the game and their contribution as well. Looking back at the history of the game's three formats, obviously Test cricket, ODIs and T20s, looking back at the laws of the game and how they came about and how they came into cricket over the years. Interesting story on how the laws were devised and planned and how they came into cricket. Looking back at some of the terms and jargon of the game and how that came about in cricket. Obviously, cricket has a lot of terms and a lot of jargon. So even those stories about how the terms came into the game and the jargon, it's quite interesting where the origins of those came from. So we'll be exploring that in this historical series and looking back at country versus country in particular Test series, for example, like Australia and England, the Ashes, the history of that between two countries over the years. So this historical series is all about, trying to promote history and trying to get people into researching the history of the game and to learn more. So we'll be starting that on the podcast in the near future. So stay tuned for episodes based on that. But I hope everyone enjoyed this episode today of the podcast. It's been great talking about this passionate topic that I'm passionate about, which is the history of the game and why we need to learn about it more and why we need to research and read up about the history, because once you do that, you fully appreciate cricket for what it is. So I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode of the podcast today. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. The podcast is now available on Anchor, Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.